how we understand global power for centuries. It's called Thucydides' trap.
Mm-hmm.
And our goal here is to really unpack the core insights from Graham Allison's work, especially his book Destined for War, and we're drawing from a specific interview with him.
Right. A very influential book.
Exactly. We want to pull out the crucial knowledge, help you get a handle on this complex idea quickly and clearly. And the big question really is this. Is conflict inevitable when a rising power challenges a ruling one? So maybe let's start right there. What exactly is Thucydides' trap?
Well, Thucydides, the ancient Greek historian often called the father of history, he spotted this really dangerous pattern. He basically said, look, when a rising power emerges and it threatens to displace a ruling power, alarm bells should be going off. Extreme danger ahead.
Yeah.
His observation was that in these situations, generally, bad things happen. It's a dynamic where things tend towards conflict.
And Allison thinks this applies now.
He argues it's the best lens for looking at the current U.S. China relationship, a rising China, a ruling U.S. And it really comes down to that famous line Thucydides wrote about Athens and Sparta. He said, it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made the war inevitable.
Fear. Okay.
So you've got two key things going on there. First, the objective reality, the actual shift in power, the correlation of forces, as it's sometimes called. Athens was genuinely getting stronger relative to Sparta.
Right. The facts on the ground.
Exactly. But second, and maybe even more critical, is the subjective part, the perceptions. Specifically, the ruling power, Sparta, in that case, becoming insecure, fearful. And that fear, Thucydides saw, tends to produce pretty predictable behaviors on both sides. It makes them vulnerable to external shocks, things that might otherwise be minor incidents but suddenly spark a huge conflict.
So is it just fear? I mean, what about things like ideology or economic competition? Don't those matter? Allison doesn't ignore those, does he?
No, absolutely not. That's a really important point. Allison would say those other factors are definitely part of the mix, always. But the fear, that Thucydides dynamic, it creates this incredibly tense atmosphere where all those other differences just get amplified. Fear isn't the only driver, but it's the dynamic that makes the situation so combustible, so likely to tip into war.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like the accelerant.
Precisely. It explains why nations might even act against their own rational self-interest sometimes, driven by the sense of perceived threat. And Allison's research really backs this up. His team looked at history, specifically the last 500 years. They identified 16 cases where a rising power genuinely threatened to displace a major ruling power.
16 cases.
Okay.
And the results?
Well, they're pretty sobering. Of those 16 cases, 12 ended in war.
12 out of 16. Wow.
Yeah. So only 4 managed to avoid war. That's why when Thucydides used the word inevitable, Allison suggests it was maybe an exaggeration for effect. It means more like highly likely or, the odds are really stacked against peace. It's a massive risk factor, but maybe not an absolute certainty.
Right. Not destiny, but a very strong tendency. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. You mentioned predictable behaviors. What kind of patterns do we typically see in these situations?
They are remarkably consistent across history. You see the rising power, let's say China today, feeling its strength growing. Quite reasonably, it starts to think, hey, our interests should count for more on the world stage. They might see the existing international order, the rules, the alliances, as kind of constraining, maybe even deliberately designed to hold them back.
And the ruling power, the U.S. in this case.
The ruling power looks at that same status quo and thinks, this system's great, it works. I mean, ironically, it's often the system that allowed the rising power to rise in the first place.
Yeah, that is ironic.
So the ruling power naturally wants to protect that system, to shore it up, defend it. And this often leads the ruling power to double down on its alliances, trying to counterbalance the rising threat. And the rising power, it does the same thing, seeks its own part.
Sometimes everyone gets entangled.
Exactly, entangled. And that sets the stage where, like we said, a seemingly small spark can ignite a huge fire. World War I is just such a dramatic case of this. You had Germany rising fast, economically, militarily.
Instilling fear in Britain.
Deep fear in Britain, the established power. So Britain tightens its links with France and Russia. Germany feels encircled, gets closer to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then bang, June 1914, the assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo by a Serbian terrorist. An event that should have been containable.
Explodes into a world war.
Precisely, because the underlying Thucydidean dynamic made the whole structure incredibly fragile.
Okay, that's a stark warning from history.
Yeah.
So let's slip to the positive side. Those 4 cases that didn't end in war, what can we learn from them? How do nations actually escape this trap?
Right. This is crucial. It comes down to what Allison calls imaginative diplomacy and, frankly, some really tough choices. Of the four successes, the two most helpful examples are probably the rise of the U.S. versus Great Britain around the turn of the 20th century
Okay.
and the Cold War rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States.
How did Britain handle the U.S. rise?
Well, Britain was facing two rising powers at once, remember, the U.S. and Germany, and they made some incredibly smart strategic decisions. They essentially used extremely imaginative diplomacy, as Allison puts it. They accommodated the U.S. rise in certain areas, like conceding naval parity and influence in the Western Hemisphere without giving up their own core vital interests.
So they bent without breaking.
Kind of, yeah. And the result was, instead of becoming rivals, they became closely aligned. So much so that when World War I broke out, the U.S. became Britain's absolute lifeline for supplies, for loans.
And eventually joined the war on their side.
Exactly. It was incredibly far-sighted diplomacy, strategic accommodation.
The Cold War, that feels different.
It was different, but equally imaginative, maybe even more so. Allison calls it one of the most creative periods in American statecraft. Think about it. George Kennan sends his famous long telegram from Moscow in '46. That sparked this intense debate in Washington. And by 1950, with a key policy document called NSC 68, the U.S. had developed this incredibly comprehensive strategy. It was basically war in every dimension except direct fighting.
The Cold War.
The Cold War. Containment, yes, but also things like the Marshall Plan, the Berlin airlift, using intelligence cleverly, economic pressure, ideological battle, all designed to manage the rivalry without triggering a catastrophic hot war with a nuclear-armed Soviet Union.
So preventing the hot war was the success case there.
Absolutely. It's a vital no-war case study.
Okay, that's helpful. But the U.S. and China today, it feels unique in some ways. Are there factors now that weren't present in those earlier cases, things that might make escaping the trap easier or harder?
Yes, definitely. And Allison highlights three big ones that actually sort of push the U.S. and China towards figuring this out constructively. Factors that encourage escaping the trap.
Okay, what are they?
First, and most obviously perhaps, nuclear weapons.
Maybe mutually assured destruction.
Exactly. May-D turns nuclear powers into, as Allison vividly puts it, Siamese twins. Strangling the other means committing suicide yourself. It forces a level of caution, a degree of, frankly, unavoidable compromise and shared risk that just didn't exist in the same way before nuclear weapons. It changes the whole calculus.
Okay, that's a big one. What else?
Second, the incredible depth of economic interdependence. U.S. and China economies are just so tangled up.
Much more than Britain and Germany before World War I.
Oh, much, much thicker, Allison argues. Think about it. A war would mean empty shelves in American Walmarts, Chinese factories making goods nobody can buy, the U.S. potentially unable to finance its deficits. It would be utterly devastating for both sides economically.
A powerful incentive to avoid conflict.
A very powerful one. And third, there's climate change.
An existential threat for everyone.
Right. On the current path, emissions from just the U.S. and China alone could lead to an uninhabitable planet for our great-great-great-grandchildren. And there are basically no solutions to climate change unless both the U.S. and China are deeply involved in tackling it together. The atmosphere doesn't care about borders.
So nuclear weapons, economic ties, climate change. These are strong forces pushing against conflict.
They are. They provide huge incentives for cooperation.
But despite those powerful forces pushing for cooperation, there are still so many areas of competition, of friction. Why is it still so hard? Is today's rivalry just different somehow?
Well, yeah, the friction points are real and they are serious. That's the core challenge, isn't it? Managing this intense competition. You look at it from China's perspective. They're asking, why should the U.S. Navy be the dominant force in the South China Sea right off our coast? Or why is the U.S. military still on the Korean Peninsula decades after the war?
And the U.S. perspective.
The U.S. perspective is, well, hang on, we played a huge role in defeating Imperial Japan, creating the post-war order in Asia that allowed everyone, including China, to prosper and grow peacefully for decades.
Right.
And Allison kind of sums up the Chinese response as being like, yes, okay, thank you very much for that. We appreciate it. But that was then. This is now. Our time has come.
A fundamental clash of narrative.
A fundamental clash. And then you layer on specific flashpoints. Taiwan and its status, Hong Kong's diminishing freedoms under Beijing, North Korea rattling its cage with missile tests.
ICBMs, yeah.
Intercontinental ballistic missiles, exactly. Things that create regional instability and could easily draw the major powers in. So the immense challenge is trying to manage this central structural rivalry, while desperately trying not to get dragged into the Thucydides trap by North Korea or by some accident at sea or some miscalculation, some impulse.
Right. So bringing it all together for you, our listener, are we destined for war or not? What's the bottom line here?
You know, Allison gives this great yes and no answer, which I think is really insightful. He says, yes, we probably are destined for war if we just carry on with business as usual.
Because history suggests that's the most likely outcome.
Exactly. Business as usual will likely produce history as usual. And in the nuclear age, that's unthinkable, catastrophic. But, he says, the answer is also no. Because, as the philosopher Santayana said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. We can study history. We aren't doomed to repeat the mistakes.
We have agency.
We have agency. Wars don't have to be, desired or even seem conceivable to happen. Think about General MacArthur in 1950. He thought war with China was inconceivable. Sir Edward Grey in Britain before World War I didn't want war.
Yet they happen.
Yet they happened. So the point of understanding the trap isn't to be fatalistic. It's to recognize the extreme danger and then be motivated to find creative ways out.
Okay, so that leads directly to the solutions.
Yeah.
Allison talks about needing painful adaptations and adjustments from both sides. That sounds, well, painful.
It is. It absolutely is. It requires real political will and strategic foresight. Interestingly, he points out that the Chinese sometimes show a capacity for this long-term thinking. Deng Xiaoping, for instance, faced with a dispute with Japan over some islands.
Yes.
His approach was basically, look, this is too hard right now. Let's just put this on the shelf for 50 years. Let future generations figure it out.
Wow. Kick the can down the road, but strategically.
Exactly. Allison thinks it's a fantastic idea, a potential model for some U.S. China issues. Just agree to disagree for a long time. Now, for the American side, the adaptation is maybe even harder psychologically. It means really waking up to the reality that China isn't just rising anymore. It has risen. It's now a peer competitor, roughly equal overall, and actually superior in quite a few areas already.
Allison has that quiz, right?
Yeah, he gives this quiz to his Harvard students about when China might be number one in various fields. They guess, 2030, 2040. Then he shows the chart. Already, it's a shock.
Yeah.
So accepting that reality means we have to start asking really tough questions about our own interests. What is genuinely vital to U.S. security and prosperity versus what's just vivid things that grab headlines or maybe vested interests that made sense under different circumstances, but perhaps not now?
Can you give an example of that kind of adaptation?
Sure. He suggests, for instance, the South China Sea. Does the U.S. have a vital national interest in exactly which country owns which specific rock or reef? Maybe not an interest worth risking a major war over. Could we adapt our posture there? Or on the Korean Peninsula? Could the U.S. consider, say, putting some constraints on large-scale joint military exercises with South Korea in return for verifiable constraints on North Korea's long-range missile testing?
Trading something to get something.
Precisely. These painful adaptations, he argues, are best hammered out in serious negotiations, where basically we give something up to get something we need more, and they do the same. It's hard-nosed diplomacy based on a realistic assessment of the new power balance.
And you mentioned his work is being read by people in positions of influence in the U.S. government. People like McMaster, Mattis, Pottinger.
Yes, that's right. His ideas have certainly percolated up to the highest levels, which is encouraging. There's an awareness of the danger.
But is there a risk maybe that the idea gets, misused, like used to justify existing hardline policies rather than encouraging that imaginative diplomacy and adaptation you talked about?
That's always a risk, absolutely. A valid concern. Powerful ideas can be weaponized or selectively interpreted in politics. But Allison's core message isn't just beware the trap. It's really about the necessity of those difficult, often painful adaptations on both sides. Real imaginative diplomacy means moving beyond just recognizing the danger. It means being willing to question sacred cows, make tough compromises, and genuinely engage in statecraft, not just posturing.
Okay, so we've taken a deep dive today into Thucydides' trap. We've seen it's a powerful, recurring pattern in history, a really critical lens for understanding U.S. China relations. But, and this is key, it's not a prophecy. It's not inevitable. It's a warning, a call for that imaginative action, a challenge to avoid just sleepwalking into history as usual.
Right. And maybe that leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Given everything we've discussed, the historical odds, but also those unique modern factors like nuclear weapons, the intertwined economies, the shared threat of climate change, What responsibility do we have? As citizens who are now aware of this dynamic, what role can we play in encouraging the kind of imaginative, maybe even painful diplomacy that's needed to ensure history doesn't just repeat itself this time? How do we push for building a different, more secure future?